for still being here after 2 days. I'm going to try to tell you a story so as not to bore you with too much technicalities about Sudan. I came into this work working on the side of, like many of you, a donor, and a big shout out to my extended family from OTI. But at some point, working in Sudan with a donor like USAID and OTI became so difficult, especially around 2009 when the ICC was about to pass an arrest warrant for President Bashir. And I was spending most of my work hours inside national security offices being interrogated about the work. That's when I realized that it's no longer possible to do what I want to do with a traditional civil society and the traditional model of support from donors. So the story I'm about to talk about is mainly about the emergence of a very unconventional civil society working in what I believe is probably under Africa's most repressive regime, the National Congress Party and Omar Bashir's regime. I'm going to start a little bit by talking about the political context in Sudan, because I don't want to assume that all of you are Sudan experts or have worked in Sudan or know anything about it. So basically, we've been living under a dictatorship for the past 26 years. In June 30th of 1989, there was a military coup that overtook a democratically elected regime. And that military coup was the same regime we have now under Omar al-Bashir. Not only did we get soldiers ruling us for 26 years, but we came with an extremely oppressive ideology based on an extreme interpretation of Sharia, totally ignoring a very complex and diverse fabric of Sudanese society that was multilingual, multicultural, and multi-ethnic. Not only that, and I think one of the most repressive forms of dictatorship is a dictatorship that tries to limit access to knowledge, access to information, and even the capacity to think. And they came in with something they called their civilization project, and integrated their ideology in everything from schools to universities. They even analyzed the entire curriculum of the country that we're still stuck with now. And that part of the access to knowledge challenges is something in the age of digital technology that we're still carrying with us until today as a huge challenge, especially with the young generation. And also, since it's about technology, I wanted to speak a little bit about what kind of infrastructure we're talking about when we're talking about technology in Sudan. In terms of mobile penetration, there's been a huge shift since the early 2000s till today. And in 2013, for instance, the mobile penetration was up to 75%, which was already a huge jump from just the year before. And these statistics are coming from the International Telecommunication Union. In terms of internet penetration, it's equally a steady increase, although the statistics say that it's 23% penetration in 2013. The truth is that these statistics don't really reflect the reality, because most of the population, especially the youth, are accessing now using their mobile phones and tablets. So this does not really reflect the penetration given the use of smartphones. It also neglects the fact that 2/3 of the country is at civil war, so it doesn't take into consideration that there is a chunk of the population living in war zones like the Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile State, which is the New South, and Darfur, which has been a ongoing conflict for the last 12 years. In terms of freedom of expression, it's also a huge challenge. For the traditional media, for instance, this is a statistics from Reporters Without Borders from this year, and it ranks Sudan at 174 out of 180 countries. And in terms of the limitations on the ground, journalists on a daily basis suffer from things like newspaper confiscations. And as a matter of fact, as a policy, confiscating newspapers after they've already been printed has impoverished extinguished our traditional press to the extent that most of them are closing down, generally because they're becoming bankrupted. Journalists are constantly being detained or summoned. A huge amount of journalists since in the last decade are simply banned from writing. International journalists are also impacted. The international TV stations are often asked to leave the country, which happened in the last protest that we had, which was huge in September 2013, where Al Arabiya, for instance, was kicked out, Sky TV was kicked out, and this keeps happening all the time. One thing that happens really often and is a big problem is the amount of journalists who are facing court cases by national security. And our national security law of 2010 is extremely oppressive. It gives national security a lot of rights, including confiscation of newspapers and summoning and taking journalists to court under the premise of tarnishing the reputation of national security or under national security threats. So this is really where my personal story starts. It started in 2019, 2009, when Sudan was just about to have its first national election in 24 years. And at the time, the international community was very invested, not because it's our first election, but because the elections happened to be a milestone in a peace agreement that was signed a couple of years before that between the North and the South. And having the election was a prerequisite to allow the South to vote for its right to separate, which was where the real interest of the international civil society was. It happened that a bunch of young people in the early 20s and late teens decided that in their neighborhood there was almost zero voter education happening. They started going door to door with orange leaflets, telling people that this is your chance to overthrow the regime peacefully. And they started this campaign to overthrow the National Congress. This was the logo of the campaign. And this turned into a youth movement that's still around called Girifna. And when I first joined them, it was just 3 weeks after they had started. And I noticed that they were so courageous, more courageous than any normal civil society. They were talking not only to the local press, but also to the international press. Of course, they were using social media like crazy. And their campaign was more courageous in terms of just saying that we want to overthrow the regime than any other political opposition or pro-democracy civil society. Given that I came from the harsh experience of what it means to work for with and for registered entity. Oops, sorry.
That was new.
Is that me?
Sorry, guys.
No problem.
It's coming.
Oh. So,
Sorry.
no problem. Given that I was coming from the hard reality of what it means to be registered, working for official civil society, one of the first discussions that Girifna was having was whether they should register. And I was like, no, you have to be illegal. You can't register. It will be the end of you. And basically, this started a trend of new civil society, especially youth-led civil society, that were not registered because registration meant that you would be under a body that was overseeing the civil society, international and local, and this body was basically like security. It's exactly like a security agent of the state. So they were functioning without having offices, without having physical presence, but their main presence was in the squares, in their neighborhoods, heavily in universities, and using social media and especially the power of video to communicate. Another thing that was very unique about this new movement of an unconventional, decentralized civil society was that they managed to also reach the diaspora youth. They're not getting any support from international donors. Actually, I have a special story to tell about how afraid international donors were to work with a movement that says it wants to overthrow the regime. That I'll tell you in a little bit. But basically, they managed to really galvanize diaspora youth in an amazing way, where they had chapters in the US, in the Gulf countries, and they got most of their support, which came in kind in terms of their mobile phones and any technology they needed, and even little things, because most of the members of these movements are in their 20s and they can't really even afford to take transportation. So they were getting all of this basic, very little financial support, but from just the network of members around, the diaspora members of Sudanese youth around the world. The one thing that, especially Grifna, because from the third week that they became in existence, they were so good about not using just concentrating all the effort on social media in one platform. They managed to have a presence across many platforms, and they had a bilingual website that meant that their access to international media became so easy. They were trying to translate everything, and at the end of the day, the main challenge to the regime was that they also managed to change the political narrative in the country. They managed to speak about topics that nobody was touching on, especially, for instance, the violence inside universities and against certain minorities like Darfur students. They also spoke a lot about issues such as the stories of detainees. Detainees often were just never had a face, never had a story, but they went to families and to mothers and to videos, and at the end, every single detainee became like a personal friend, because you knew their very little stories. For instance, there was this woman called Dalia Haj-Omar. She was from the Nuba Mountains, and one of Garifna's video bloggers took an extended interview with her, because she suddenly found her house full of internally displaced family members from the Nuba Mountains. And there was an interest to help her, but there was no way to get her story out. And in the video, she basically explained that this is ethnic cleansing. And of course, she got arrested. This is a word that really, really scares the regime, and especially if it's on a video that has English subtitles and that's being shared virally in the country and abroad. Dalia Haj-Omar was in prison for about 10 months, and the Grifna movement tried so much to work with her lawyers, who were like, no media, no visibility. And after 8 months, they're like, okay, this is not working. So they launched a huge social media campaign for her called Jamila 8 months, which is the hashtag in Arabic and English. And they managed to get not only the visibility online, but also international and regional satellite TV stations were talking about her. There was even an article on Foreign Policy magazine about her. And to actually be able to talk about a woman who's a teacher and who's a mother and who was never an activist in her life, and managed to get her visibility level to that extent, was such amazing pressure on the regime that they finally let her go, although the sentence and the charge against her reached the death penalty. She was considered a traitor, and the very fact that she mentions the name of the Nuba Mountains with ethnic cleansing already made her... It's all right, I can talk about the technology. What made her a very human person, very real person. The movement also on the ground mobilized silent stands in front of her prison. And all of this was tweeted. Every time there was a trial for Dalia Haj-Omar, the entire group of youth, journalists, her court was full, to the extent that eventually they were not allowing anyone except the journalist to enter. And everyone was tweeting from inside the court, and it was laughable because the tweets reflected how weak the justice system was in Sudan, and it really embarrassed the regime. So this was just Hannah Arden telling you there's nothing better than a good story. And this is what Girifna and these youth movements are doing. They're really changing the narrative and even challenging the independent media, whose stories are usually so dry and so analytical and lacking the human touch. Just last week, Girifna won the Vaclav Havel International Prize for Creative Dissent. And it just goes to show that a movement just based on youth in their 20s who have never left the country are still able to get their voice to the extent that they're noticed outside the country. Okay, this is the real reason I'm here, and this is why Helena invited me. And it is because I realized at the end all these youth movements are under a lot of pressure. Their members get arrested, and they got very good at mobilizing for detainees because they themselves were at the receiving end of a lot of arrests. Female members had been kidnapped and raped, and they managed to really get good at it by protecting and advocating for their own. However, I think what we know from international experience is that youth movements and grassroots movements, especially when they are dissident movements, eventually people get burnt out or they don't last forever. Like, where is the Occupy movement today, for instance? So this is where SOPNA came, and the idea of it is that as a civil society in Sudan, generally, we're so bad about capturing our successes, celebrating our successes, and leaving something for the future. Because when you have this model of a decentralized civil society working under very oppressive regimes, what happens is that people leave, there's no historical memory, there's no celebration of documenting really the successes, but also the processes. I feel like this new generation doesn't need to be taught about how to use the technology, but what they need help with is putting in place processes of workflow of how to get things done. As simple as, for instance, how to crowdfund in Sudan. Crowdfunding already has its other challenges, which I'll talk in a little bit, but getting people to go through the processes instead of each time having to start from zero. And also telling stories that are considered historic experiences in the life of the civil society. For instance, in 2013, we had this huge flood that touched most of the country, and in a matter of days, the youth-led civil society managed to mobilize up to 8,000 volunteers. They came from different professions, from medicine to engineering. Some of them had never volunteered in their entire life, and it was all done through crowdsourcing on Facebook and Twitter. There was also an amazing use of other technologies like crisis maps, and the crisis map of Nafir was used by the UN and the government, and of course it took the UN and the government many weeks to react because they have to do their assessments, and by the time they did their assessment the crisis was over, and Nafir had done almost 20% of the support. But these kind of experiences for a country and a civil society that always has crises, sometimes we just go forward without looking backward and documenting these successes. So that's the idea of the platform SOPNA. Another thing was also to talk to experts, because as a civil society, at least in Sudan, we feel like we're always belly gazing and trying to find the solutions ourselves instead of looking to our neighbors in Egypt, for instance, and seeing how they're using crisis maps in more other creative ways, like fighting harassment against women. And of course, speaking to this great lady that some of you may know, about how we can use crisis mapping better in Sudan. The other thing that Sudan has as a huge challenge is that we're a country under US sanctions, and sometimes the technology doesn't work for us as well as we hope. And that includes a technology like crowdfunding, not only because it's mostly the American platforms that that people are using that are most popular, but also because the sanctions are economic in nature. Most of the people living in Sudan have never even seen a credit card. The idea of doing transactions online are so hard. So being able to tell the civil society or people who want to do it that there is a way to do it, it may require collaboration with Sudanese who are in the diaspora, or Sudanese who are in the country who used to be diaspora, who have bank accounts outside. Just these little solutions that normal people who are starting to use technologies for the first time may not be exposed to, sometimes need to be documented somewhere. And this is the same idea of being able to capture processes and tell people what is the best way to go about it. Okay, so I know that I've spoken a lot about these youth movements, and they're mostly started in the northern part of the country. But I also, since Sudan, most of the oppression and the nature of oppression is really about the center and that is marginalizing the peripheries. I really want to speak about the same kind of innovative use of technology to document some of the conflicts that are so difficult and are almost the most underreported in the world. For instance, in the Nuba Mountains, the Nuba Mountain has been in conflict since 2011. It's probably one of the hardest places to get to, not only because now the only way to come in was through South Sudan, and now South Sudan itself is in conflict. But the government does not legally allow any international journalists or any humanitarian organizations to work there. So this project, Newburyport, is a collective of civil society that started to reach out to normal citizens who never had any exposure to even holding a camera or any kind of exposure to using the internet, and giving them equipment and very basic training to document what's happening in the region. Through their platform, you can actually see little things like how many bombs have dropped on the conflict since the beginning of the conflict. You can see real-time videos of what's happening there. And it's been a platform that's producing probably the most consistent reporting out from the Nuba Mountains. And it's from the perspective of just citizens. But there's an interesting shift in the way that they're reporting, in the last 6 months has become much more professionalized. So it also shows you that there is the dynamic where something that can start as very loose and informal citizen journalism can move to something that is being captured, like their stuff gets captured by The Guardian nowadays and gets reproduced there. This is, the Newburyport is in English, and the idea of it was to inform the rest of the world. But after a while, they realized that even Sudanese don't know what's happening in these conflict areas. Sudan is a huge country, and there tends to be a huge disconnect between the people who are living in the urban centers and Darfur, the Nuba Mountains, the state, and the government usually does not like any mention of these conflicts in the daily newspapers, circulation of state-controlled media. So this ayn, which means look, basically, is a sister kind of project with the Newburyport that is completely focused on targeting normal Sudanese citizens and educating them about what's happening in their own country and in the conflict zones. This is about the rise of satire, political satire. So we just had elections in Sudan this month, actually. They were a total non-event, completely boycotted by citizens and, of course, the civil society and the political parties. And during a week before the elections, a group of activists, and they happened to be in the Nuba Mountains, actually, or in a war zone, started producing these videos. And the videos were using puppets and mimicking important members of the regime. The Minister of Defense, the president. And so far they've produced, just in a matter of months, they've produced with what looks like very professional puppets, a series of like 8 or 9 very funny videos. Of course, this is the kind of thing that drives the government crazy. During the elections, actually, the week of the election, there was so much technical violence against a lot of websites that are usually anti-regime. A lot of them got DOS attacks. But since they were brand new and the government didn't know about them, somehow they managed to not get hit. And when you go to their website, their Facebook page, which is just like a week old, the amount of people who are watching these are like 55,000 clicks per video, 100,000 clicks per video, which also shows that in a country where there's so much misery, people do want to hear a perspective that is lighter and funnier than the rigid and serious, complete seriousness that we usually get. So yesterday, towards the end of the day, the conversation shifted towards the importance of art and music and dance. So this is a little project that started as a family project, actually, and it became global. It's almost an hour, like 65 minutes movie called Beats of the Antonov. It's shot in the Nuba Mountains, and it's really talking about Sudanese identity, but from the angle of people experiencing war in the Nuba Mountains. And this is the trailer which the camera will play.
That would be very promising if I say something right.
I've been asked to wrap it up, but I'll just comment quickly about the film. You notice that it's very watchable, and if you see it in its entirety, although it's shot in a war zone, it's really happy. It uses music and dance as a segue to talk about very complicated issues such as national identity, which in Sudan we haven't even had a chance as citizens to have this very important dialogue about who we are as Sudanese. And the film manages to reach that through talking to very normal people, because this idea of a national dialogue of who we are as Sudanese has always been kind of hijacked by the intellectuals, the elite, the academics, and to be able to speak to normal citizens who are all in refugee camps, to talk about that makes it such an accessible topic, especially if it's coming from the angle of music and dance. So I will open it up for questions. And thank you so much.
So I think we just have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions or comments for Dalia. Yeah, Tessa in the back. We'll get a microphone back to you.
I can speak loudly.
Great.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much. Your timing was perfect because during our Futures Thinking workshop, builders, they will be able to tap into a global network of individuals who want to support them to do the work that they do, sidestepping the institutions, right? And you just illustrated that happening with your Vietnam, right? It was absolutely amazing to hear what they're doing totally on their own without the traditional institutions. And so I wanted to ask if you could just tell us a little more about where are they now? What are they doing now? What's kind of the result of their network of local peace builders that are working outside of those institutions?
Okay, I didn't have the time to talk more, but basically this model of a decentralized civil society, especially that is youth-led and volunteer-based, is becoming more common in Sudan. So we're not only seeing it with the very politicized groups like Sudan Change Now and Grifna, but we're also seeing it with cultural groups. For instance, there's a very popular group called Mafrouj that just via Facebook manages to get together once a month, every month, around 3,000 people to exchange books. Because the government was basically banning or confiscating any event that was very formal, like an properly organized book fair, for instance. So by doing this, the government it can never really confiscate beforehand because they don't know what people are going to come to this mafrouch, which means like just putting things on the ground. And it created a new market also for booksellers. That couldn't function under such a repressive regime. So there is this kind of model is being replicated also in education. There's a group called Education Without Borders that also uses the same model of getting volunteers to refurbish schools and doing reading groups and a national day of reading in the country, and all just using social media to. So it is becoming a common model. About Girfna and Sudan Change Now, they're still there. They're working under very difficult conditions. A lot of the members are not able to really be tell that they're even being part of these movements, because during big protests, I didn't have the chance to really talk about the protests, but a lot of these movements were really a big push behind the national protests that's been happening in Sudan in the last couple of years. Even at the time when they're all either underground, hiding, or behind prison, the few of them who are outside and the few that are in the diaspora managed to inform the public what's happening in the streets and to mobilize huge protests. So they are definitely not working under easy conditions, but they still are there.
Yeah, Charlie.
Yes, first of all, thank you for a tremendous presentation. You're part of some extremely brave individuals, and you wear your bravery very lightly. One of the most sad and ironic aspects of South Sudan's situation since independence is that the Juba government has adopted many of the techniques that it fought so long and so hard to break away from in terms of freedom of the press and freedom of expression. Do you think that you have things that you could teach your South Sudanese counterparts in terms of highlighting the regime's crackdown in these areas? And indeed, are you involved in networks elsewhere in the region with other associations which are concerned with these things?
Okay. In terms of networking regionally, we were very close to the Egyptian April 6th movement, which really inspired us at the beginning of the Egyptian revolution. But unfortunately, some of them are behind bars, and the movement in Egypt even is now banned. So it's sad to also see that regression regionally. However, it is difficult to have very close relationships regionally to sustain them when it's difficult to leave the country. So that's one challenge. About South Sudan is very complicated. I have to say that maybe the biggest mistake is for a rebel movement that has known only to hold the gun for 20 years to just take off its clothes and become a government. They should have just let the movement rest and keep it being respected as a movement and started from scratch maybe as a civilian government. So it is definitely this exactly photocopy of what's happening in the north, and it's a huge leadership failure. But there is a thriving civil society in South Sudan. They are working under difficult conditions. They are using technology. And even Grifna, when it first started, it did have, and it still has members who are South Sudanese and based in the south. There is that relationship, although it's split, but the movement, when it started in 2009, the country was still one country. So there is that still collaboration with the south. But I think they're living under, their infrastructure is completely different. I tried to start by explaining the infrastructure and the economics. In the north, it's extremely very cheap for anybody to afford a daily or a monthly plan of internet on their phone. And that situation may not be replicated in parts of South Sudan, especially the more remote parts. So they're also dealing with a very different reality in terms of connectivity and economics.
So I think we'll close it there, and a big round of applause. You want to take one more? Okay. Good.
Yeah, my question was just around security, because the projects are amazing. I didn't want to applaud you for the amazing stories you're telling about this, but the one thing that I wonder about as an organization that would love to support important initiatives like this is how are the groups that are doing this thinking about their own security, and how can we engage in from the international community perspective in a way that doesn't further place people who are involved in this business at risk.
Okay, that's a tricky question. But I want to tell a little story. If I have anything to tell the international community and donors in countries like that, it's just to be a little bit courageous. During the protests of 2012 Sudan revolts, we as a movement needed one thing, and it was not technology, it was not phones, it was not computers, it was just blank paper, boxes and boxes. We really wanted to go in the streets with more paper to mobilize in the street, and most of our movement was behind prison, and the few who were there were having so high hopes, because it's really a moment where you feel like maybe this is the edge, maybe this regime would fall. And it's a movement that does not take money from donors, but the one time they wanted something from a donor was boxes of paper. And I'm not going to say who the donor was, or who the donors in Khartoum were, but they were not courageous enough to even give paper to a movement that is not a non-violent movement. So I think for donors, just listen to the needs, and in times of need, respond, and not in times where you feel like you are ready to give. So it's a conversation.